Hello and welcome to Springboard. I'm your host, Ahlia Bethea. On today's episode, we're diving into the evolving intersection of construction and sustainability, from the decarbonization of materials to the policy and practical realities shaping how our buildings are built. I'm joined by two very special guests, Amanda Kaminsky and Alexis Saba. Amanda Kaminsky is Director of Sustainability for Consigli Construction. She brings over 2 decades of expertise in leading multidisciplinary teams to implement and standardize sustainability improvements across various construction practices, including organics collection, concrete decarbonization, drywall recycling, and the adoption of electric construction equipment. Amanda also sits on the boards of Carbon Leadership Forum, Health Product Declaration Collaborative, Construction and Demolition Recycling Association, Recycling Certification Institute, and Center for Zero Waste Design. We are also joined by one of my fellow associates here at Cy Padgett and Rizal, Alexis Saba. Alexis focuses her practice on environmental and land use law and litigation. Most recently, she has been working with clients to understand and comply with New York State and City climate and building decarbonization requirements, such as New York City's Local Law 97 of 2019. This work includes green leasing, landlord-tenant negotiations, solar storage development, penalty mitigation, and strategic planning. Okay, so now that everyone knows who we'll be speaking with, let's get into it. Welcome to Springboard, Amanda and Alexis. So Alexis, to kick things off, can you give us a quick overview of Local Law 97, what it is, what it requires, and what kinds of impacts it's having?
Sure. So it's certainly top of mind for folks these days. Last year, 2024, was the first compliance year for many covered buildings. And this year, 2025, is the first reporting year. The law was passed by the New York City Council in 2019, and it requires most large buildings in New York City to measure and limit their greenhouse gas emissions. Local Law 97 grew out of years of benchmarking building energy use in New York City, so that going into the law regulating building emissions, the city already had, as did building owners, a wealth of information about building energy use. And with that, the city was, at least in theory, able to intelligibly regulate building emissions. The key for this conversation is that Local Law 97 regulates operational emissions, meaning what the building is emitting based on its fuel and electricity use or its power use. The missing piece at this stage is embodied carbon, which is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the actual building materials. So I look forward to focusing on this topic with Amanda today. On the whole, Local Law 97 is interesting in many ways. It's certainly a brand new regulatory environment, but it is also coming at a time when the regulated community, building owners, are experiencing sustainability pressures and influences from a lot of different directions. More and more big corporate tenants are interested in sustainability and have aggressive sustainability goals. Individual people are interested in sustainability, the health of their buildings, their experiences in those buildings. There are more and more pressures from investors to demonstrate various sustainability metrics, including greenhouse gas emission reductions. So, at the same time that there's been the development of this regulatory environment, there's also been the maturation of a private sector push for sustainability. But I'm excited to hear from Amanda about her experience on the construction side, because that seems like the future of the building sustainability conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us, Alexis. And so, Amanda, let's dig right into it. What does sustainability mean in construction these days? And how has that concept perhaps evolved since you began in the industry?
Yeah, so I think sustainability in its very earliest stages from my memory are just really the aspects of energy efficiency that was born out of the cost of energy in the 70s into the 80s and the reaction to that in spurring conservation of the sources that we use for heating, cooling, electrification, all of the systems that we need in our daily lives to be powered. That sort of evolved into more of a kind of maybe a multimodal, implementation of, okay, it's not just that energy impact and the systems that we put in our buildings that we can utilize to reduce that energy use, but also resource conservation, also really looking at the toxicity. I think Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, really spurred an awareness around the impacts of toxicity on all of our systems. And so, obviously, then we had LEED certification, the U.S. Green Building Council, that happened late 90s, early 2000s. And that then, I think, has really helped the built environment to address a lot of different aspects and really also measure impact in buildings. And so I think more recently, we're really seeing people addressing things like embodied carbon in the supply chain. And it can be tricky because it's the ROI on some of these things is a little bit more challenging upfront to make the case for, and yet the impacts are very real from a supply chain perspective. And so I think people are really looking at, though, the climate change considerations to our built environment. Obviously energy efficiency still plays into that very strongly, but so does the embodied carbon and what it takes to build these buildings, the structure especially. And so I think most recently what's been very compelling is some of the different gauges of how we're doing globally in, from an environmental measurement standpoint. The Stockholm Resilience Center, I think for the last something like 10 to 15 years has been, they have a planetary boundaries framework that they're measuring across many different factors. And so climate change is obviously on that, but uh, it's kind of a warning signaling, but also there's some optimistic stories in that in those graphics that help people to understand. Okay, so we were exceeding ozone. The stratospheric ozone depletion was a real problem. A couple of decades ago, we really, through the Montreal Protocol and a lot of actions resulting from that, we're able to now keep that within. Now it's within the planetary boundaries, it's not exceeding. And so I think there's like good stories in that as well, but you see the climate change and chemical pollution boundaries being increasingly exceeded. We are exceeding, and the exceedance is increasing. And so I think some of these measures that are holistic and systemic and not just focused on one category are beneficial. They make decision making much more complex, though.
Absolutely. And, just to sort of build off of that, I do have a question in terms of private versus public sector. What you were just talking about in terms of that definition, is that similar? Is that uniform across the private and public sector in terms of how they define it, but also how they prioritize sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of both public and private sector are, a lot of projects differ to like LEED certifications, and then more locally are developing regulations and codes akin to Local Law 97, for instance, that help to contextualize and make more specific some of the energy and climate requirements or incentives. And so there's a real power in government regulation of improvements on this front. And so when the public sector does regulate, I think it can set a really great precedent for what happens in the private sector. And obviously it can happen in the opposite direction as well. Sometimes bringing the baseline up is is most effectively actualized by the public sector. I think the kind of more leading progress can sometimes be charted by the private sector. And so I think those can work really well together to show what's possible, but also ensure that we're bringing every or most buildings along in the improvements that we're making locally and then sometimes statewide as well, and sometimes federally. We've seen obviously there's maybe a more hyper focus on the local right now, both at the city and the state level, but there's continued progress.
So that's great. And it does sound like there's a lot of positive momentum in this area right now. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how we are ensuring transparency and accountability when it sounds like a lot of entities are relying on the LEED certification, as you said, but there isn't actually one single uniform metric, correct? So, how do you ensure that we're all striving towards the same goals and being transparent?
I mean, I would say something that's been really beneficial for a number of years now is Energy Star benchmarking, just to understand what the energy performance of a building is, and that's utilized pretty broadly. LEED is pretty comprehensively either LEED or compliance that some entities require that's akin to LEED. I would say that's, I think people look for, okay, is a building achieving any level of LEED certification? And there's a certain level of transparency to that, and yet there's obviously a whole host of different credits that a project can go for. So unless you have access to that like scorecard, it's not always as transparent as that Energy Star score. That's pretty accessible. I think that we have seen a change over the last 10 years or so in some aspects of transparency as it pertains to things like what's in building products and the requirement for manufacturers to publish publicly what those contents are. And that seems like that's something that always just should have been a thing. And it wasn't for many years, and it's still not required across the board, but it's becoming more standard for that to be. It's just becoming more of a norm that that if you're going to buy the product and it's going to live in your building for many decades, ideally, that you should be able to know what the ingredients are. And so that's another facet of transparency at a more micro level.
I want to open this question up to both of you. Let's talk a little bit about the drivers. What's really pushing sustainability forward in construction today? Is it regulation? Alexis, is it client pressure, cost savings, or is it something else?
I mean, my sense is that it's really across the board. I've heard from folks that the regulations don't necessarily move the needle as much as you would think, but certainly real investment pressure if you're operating at the very high end of the market, maybe kind of commercial tenant pressure. But it does seem to me that there's kind of the confluence of those pressures plus the regulatory pressure plus on the construction side, and again, Amanda, I'd be curious to hear what you say, increasing availability of certain materials. And you can see it in the operational standpoint too. You have better, more finely tuned building management systems, better technology, more people from the operations standpoint who know how to use that technology. You have systems that are better able to work together, occupant sensors, things like that. So that kind of aside from those external pressures, you're able to meet those demands from the technology or equipment side, which also relates to the measurement aspect of it. Because if you can't measure, you can't provide the data, then you can't really accurately report out on it. You don't know very much if you're making improvements year over year. So I think all those factors together make it something that can really happen, and presumably all of that would kind of should continue to improve.
Yeah, I agree, Alexis, and I I think on a number of different fronts, the liability of not being proactive in this space where, you eventually might have stranded assets if you're not kind of keeping up with what's expected of operational efficiencies for, depending on whether you as an owner tend to intend to hold on to an asset or to sell that asset in 10, 15, 20 years. The investments that are being made now and the decision making now really affects that viability that far into the future. And so there's a lot that needs to go into factoring in what are people going to want from this asset in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And are the decisions that I'm making right now conducive to that projection? Obviously, it's hard to see the future. Especially right now, but I think that that's always factoring in. And depending on the type of asset, we do a lot of Consigli does a lot of healthcare work, and so those clients and life science clients as well of ours definitely are maybe on the front end of factoring health into the spaces that they're building or renovating. A doctor's edict is to first do no harm. And so they are very much, maybe more than other clients, really always taking that aspect of sustainability very seriously. And so that is a big driver for them. And I think that also helps to push the industry and make it, I think nobody would say they're anti health. But that progress that some of those projects make helps to make that actioning of the data into like improvement of products over time and then ability to purchase those products for no added cost much easier for everybody else. And so I think then in the residential space or the office space, there's a lot of differences in how these projects use energy on a daily basis. And sometimes there's the capability and people are getting smarter and smarter about how to optimize energy usage on more of a district scale. And that's really exciting, I think. So, I think it's kind of building type by building type, but then also neighborhood by neighborhood, what might make sense. But I really appreciate when project teams and regions can kind of think at that bigger systems and neighborhood or district level. It's hard to do because you have to get everybody coordinated, not just your project team, but then even sometimes other project teams to make something work at that bigger district level.
That's great. It's sort of surprising, but also it makes sense that you have certain projects, depending on who's involved, they may have priorities, such as putting health first, or if it's a purely sustainability centered projects such as some of our climate resiliency projects that we see, these things will obviously be at the forefront. But once these projects show what's possible, you have other people who may not have been initially prioritizing them being willing to sort of join this movement and be compliant with some of these standards. So that's great to hear. But on the flip side, can you talk a little bit about what's holding sustainability back in construction?
Oh, yes. Just as much, but luckily I think these are all fixable challenges, but I think obviously cost is always a factor, and I think sometimes it's perceived cost, and sometimes it's that first cost and the fact that or the tendency for upfront capital cost budgets to be separate from operating budgets, and they really should be very intertwined and factoring kind of cross-referencing, but they're very frequently not, and there's usually different people involved. I worked with a developer for a number of years who I just have a lot of respect for in the way that they would always have their building engineer who is going to be operating the building and overseeing its systems involved from the very start of construction, attending all of the meetings that had any relevance to the operation of the building. That's the way to do it. Many projects don't do that. And I think that helps to resolve a lot of those ROI considerations that really help a project to make the smartest capital investments. So, and then one other thing I'll just mention is that there is huge risk aversion and inertia to change in construction, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, safety is incredibly important in construction. There's so much room for dramatic improvement in how we build the structure of buildings, and yet it's those structures of the building that obviously hold them up and so support a lot of life. And so it makes sense that people would kind of want to do what they've done before. Some of my favorite structural engineers are the ones that are the safest and the most careful, but also the most progressive. And that's not always a balance that is easy to find in a structural engineer. And so I get it, right? It's a conundrum sometimes, but there are ways to take care around risk and to progress with risk safely. But that's, it's a reason I would say 90% of practitioners in, construction, design, probably want to do something that they've done before, and maybe more like 10% is really focused on, okay, yes, we want to take what we've learned from before, but then progress it a bit more to make some changes on the next work and use each project as a stepping stone towards a better building. So yeah, I think those are the major ones that I've seen.
I was curious, just to jump in, whether you thought from the building materials side that it's kind of more significant to be developing new low carbon building materials or supporting the existing options versus reusing materials. Presumably it's both. I just didn't know kind of what the balance is in terms of reducing emissions and quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think always really looking at what the opportunity is for either partial or full reuse of a structure, first and foremost, always makes sense. Sometimes structures, because of the next use of a project, next intended use of a project or a site rather, just can't be reused, or there's structural integrity that's lacking. It's also just a good lesson, but it also a huge challenge for our engineers and designers to really think about, like, how our designers have a lot on their plate. How do you make a building that is super well suited for the use at hand, but also able to be used in other ways going forward, ideally, even if you don't predict that that's going to happen. A lot of times it does, like we see right now with office buildings needing to be turned into residential space to the greatest extent possible. So I think it's that for certain. And, I think there's a lot of creativity at play right now in really looking at wherever we can take some of this office space that's underutilized and turn it into residential. I think there is also a lot of focus, which is kind of wonderful, through some of the EDC materials that have come out recently on design and construction circularity guidelines, and also just reusing component materials wherever that's possible. And sometimes that's reuse into reusing that material into its same exact purpose. Sometimes it's recycling that material. Sometimes there's a retrofit involved. Sometimes even reusing actual steel members and not recycling them, but using them as is, or slightly refabricating. So that space is super exciting, and I think burgeoning, only continuing to grow. But then we do really also need to diversify what materials are available for, when we do need to build new. I personally have never worked on a greenfield project that I can think of. I've always worked in kind of urban settings where either a building is being retrofitted or a building is needing to be deconstructed to build a new building. And so that's just my experience. And so there's that question is always at play in the segment of the marketplace where we are really looking at, okay, what's our palette of materials right now? The concrete space is a pretty rich one because there's so much room for improvement, and yet we still have to have this material function really well. And the word function is a really loaded one because it's like How do we make sure that it performs, in the short term in as far as gaining strength, but also long term as far as durability goes in the midst of the elements that we have at play? If it's along the coastline, what about the chloride impact of just various aspects of stormwater? But then how do we also make sure that the performance keeps improving with regard to embodied carbon and other health considerations? And so it's a really, there's a lot of different ways to make a concrete mix. It's like making a cake in some ways, but it's higher stakes, obviously. Doesn't just have to taste good. um, and so that's I've had a lot of involvement in that space because of all that, all of the room for improvement. And especially right now where, we are, I think there's where there might be kind of political alignment is that I think everybody agrees that, hey, wherever it makes sense to make domestically, let's do that. There are materials that still do need to come in from other places or components of materials, but we do have a lot of opportunity here to replace some of the elements of a concrete mix with domestic products. And because a lot of our concrete components are coming in from abroad, especially the components that help to decarbonize concrete. For instance, we try to reduce as much as possible the cement in our concrete because it's so high energy to make, and the energy that's used to make it typically is very highly emitting and dirty. And so even though cement only makes up like 12% ish of a concrete mix, it's responsible for 80 to 90% of its greenhouse gas emission impact. And so, but a lot of the replacements for cement, right now, a lot of it is slag, especially in New York here, and that's a byproduct of steel making. But most of that material is coming in from abroad. And so I think really to diversify that those options for our batch plants, everybody is really on board with that. And so I like to spend a lot of my time on things that have on efforts that have many reasons behind them. Your reason might be, or what might motivate somebody might be to decarbonize, but for somebody else, like a concrete batch plant, they want the safety that exists in like a lot of diversified options. They also want it to perform well. So does our structural engineer. So does the owner. The architect might want it to look a certain way. So we're also considering, what components make it easier for a concrete to look a certain way for the architect. Sometimes that's lighter colored concrete. And then from the construction management side of things, we want to make sure it doesn't impact schedule. And so that's a lot of it's a lot of factors. And so there's not that many options right now that can solve for all of those things, but there are a few. One of them is like locally recycled glass, like glass bottles from like spaghetti jars, beer bottles, wine bottles, that can go into making a cement replacement. That's not just a filler in concrete, but it's pozzolanic in the mix, so it helps the concrete gain strength. It also makes the concrete less permeable, so that allows less water intrusion, so it protects against the concrete expanding and contracting through freeze-thaw cycles, and so it reduces cracks. So that's just one example that's kind of exciting because it's locally sourced. It's solving for a broader recycling issue where a lot of that glass otherwise goes to landfill or gets downgraded into roadbed. And it's also solving for a need, a local need, a local sourcing need for decarbonizing our concrete mixes.
For our listeners, it's worth noting that everyone lit up with a smile on their face when Amanda mentioned the alignment around locally sourcing materials. Let's follow the path of least resistance, has the most support. We can all get behind that.
There's also an interesting component of the fascination with how something's made, and I've one thing I've heard that can be tricky about the embodied carbon side of things is that it's something that ordinary people maybe don't interact with very much versus, you know, you know when you turn on a light that the power has to come from somewhere, or you're used to thinking about operational emissions more. But I think part of what's really interesting about more of the embodied side is this opportunity to really understand how something is made and where all of the different pieces come from. Just kind of piques people's curiosity in a particular way if you can get people engaged in that in that way, maybe it would have kind of ramifications in terms of how people think about our larger systems.
Oh my gosh, Alexis, that's such a good point. And I also, I think also in, being in construction, I love being able to, we spend a lot of time going to our job sites, but then we also spend a lot of time going to our recycling facilities. When we're setting up a recycling plan for a project, I go visit the recycling facility and really understand what's really possible to recycle at that facility. And then we structure our plans for the for recycling, what we might sort of separate on a construction site based on the capabilities of that recycling facility. But similarly, with regard to manufacturing, I kind of hate when a manufacturing location is super far away because it's hard to go visit the manufacturing site and kind of see, keep tabs on what's happening and really truly understand all of how we might optimize the product. It really helps to get to know the manufacturer. And when they're local, it's much easier to kind of deepen that relationship and keep making improvements on a single project, but then project to project. So you're totally right about that. And just, I think it helps with transparency, really understanding, um, that what you ask for is what you're getting on a kind of broad scale, but also on a micro scale. That follow through is really important and it's easier to do when it's close by.
Yeah, makes sense.
Amanda, just to go back to part of your answer earlier in that question, when I first started learning about this space, cost was often cited as a major barrier, and you mentioned it again today. But these sustainability conversations have been going on for decades. Are materials getting cheaper? Do we see costs becoming less of a factor at some point, or will that always be a barrier or a driver for some of the lag?
I have not typically seen that be an issue. It's like, sometimes people refer to it as like sometimes it's real and sometimes it's not. So I think like there's sort of this green premium sometimes people either perceive or is real because, maybe a manufacturer might see that they can charge a little bit more because of the kind of green halo that something might have on it. I think it's almost like a little like when my husband and I got married, we kind of eloped and then came back and had a party and we didn't tell the venue that it was for a wedding and we feel like we got a really good deal and it's almost like
Really?
if you don't talk too much about the don't talk too much about the that aspect and really just hone in on with the manufacturer. Well, if there is any kind of premium, like, well, where's that premium come from? You know, there was I think just part of this results from just being able to go visit recycling facilities or going to visit manufacturing facilities. I think sometimes there can be a real true premium if you're starting to produce something that's not at scale or volume yet. That's typically a real cost because you're kind of having to do something one off maybe, or you just don't have the economy of scale yet if your whole production line is this new product, right? So that's real. Where sometimes we've gotten some pushback from a recycler where they say, okay, if you're going to source separate this material, that load is going to be denser and therefore the fuel is going to be more expensive. So we need to charge more. And we said, hey, wait a minute, though. You don't have to sort that material at your site. Doesn't that save you a ton of labor cost? Oh, yeah, you know what? You're right. Let's just that's just a wash then. So I think just like, but you don't know that unless you go to the recycling facility and see like how much time is spent on sorting. It can be a painstaking process, but it takes a lot of time. But it's important to do. But if you're kind of doing a lot of that preventative labor on site, that's saving a lot of time and money, and therefore like either maybe we should get a kickback or let's just call it even. And so I think just really getting knowledgeable about where the increase is and whether it's real or not, and how to work together to also reduce that over time. I've definitely seen some owners be willing to pay a little bit more for a product when it is new, but if they see a time horizon towards cost parity over 5 years or so because of increase in scale and their role in helping with that scale. There's also things like offsets that some folks or insets for helping manufacturers get to the point of scale where the added cost investment or price investment is not needed anymore. So it's kind of helping and sometimes it's the folks that are actually buying the product that might purchase those insets, and sometimes it might be a third party that wants to invest in that manufacturer, and they help out by purchasing those insets also to reduce their own carbon footprint. And so there's a lot of different ways to structure the growth of companies that have these real costs until they can get to a point where there's close to cost parity, or at least where it feels like it's doable for a broader scale of the marketplace to buy into a new product or system.
Do you think there's room for targeted regulation in this way to try to spur some of the economy of scale?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group called the Center for Green Market Activation, and they are, for instance, like they're working on specifically kind of regulating how the decarbonization of some of these components can happen more effectively and build trust. I think it's super key that when we're trying new things, we kind of pilot them enough that we gain the knowledge that's needed to then standardize that system or product to the point where it then can more easily scale because of the trust that's been born out of the standardization. So I think that's one good example. Obviously there are carbon trading markets too that exist around the world. So when you say standardization, is that kind of what you mean, Alexis, or were you asking that in kind of a different way?
No, that's helpful. Just trying to think about how, kind of what's the role in government in this. Um, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, one way
Yeah.
traditionally is for the government to impose requirements on itself for purchasing and building to try to help build up a certain market, build up the economy of scale. But just thinking, really off the cuff about kind of targeted regulations that might help provide another angle to push the development in certain areas. But again, the supply has to be there, the proven safety has to be there. Otherwise it's not gonna work. So just thinking about what that lever looks like in this context.
Yeah, I think government has a huge role to play in, especially in the scale aspect of scale. And I think if there's careful, thoughtful kind of forecasting about, okay, this is what's going to come into play in a year or 2 years, I think sunrising requirements in advance to signal to industry about what's coming so that it doesn't cause uncertainty, but it gives those indicators very clearly so that the industry knows what it needs to get done to comply. I think frequently a lot of players in industry don't want to make things in a lot of different ways. And so if it's being required by the state of New York to, make concrete in a certain way or with a certain global warming potential, it starts to, maybe concrete's a bad example because it's so hyper local, but for other makers that might sell into many different states, they might just say, you know what, like we're not going to make our steel in a lot of different ways. We want to comply with this regulation, and we forecast that a lot of other states are going to follow along. That is super powerful in starting to really reduce impact more broadly. We've seen it many times with the state of California, but I think other states are really leading on that front too.
So, can we zoom out a little bit and just talk comparatively? I mean, you mentioned California is obviously at the forefront of a lot of this, and New York as well. But how does the United States as a whole compare to other countries in terms of progress, in terms of sustainable construction? Is there a model you think we should be looking to, or are we setting the pace in some areas? Is California really the model that we should all be following?
No, I don't. I don't think always. I know there's sort of this. We have to kind of bring the bring places along as they, we kind of know that they're ready enough, but and have enough of the infrastructure. Sometimes like regulation can motivate the development of the infrastructure that's necessary to meet the requirement, but there's sort of a baseline level of infrastructure that is needed to kind of put a regulation into place to begin with in many cases. And so I do think California has been very leading on that front. British Columbia, Vancouver has been very progressive on a lot of these fronts. The UK has as well. When I think about like electrification of equipment, including construction process equipment, Scandinavia has been very leading in, sometimes having construction sites that are completely zero emission. So, you need the charging infrastructure for that. And so you need the kind of regulatory structures. Here in New York City, sometimes a challenge has been that, we've had some fires from lithium ion batteries. They're from micro mobility devices that in many cases weren't just off the shelf devices that had been rehabilitated over time with different batteries. And that has caused, understandably, our fire department to be very on guard and cautious about batteries. And so the timeline to get a battery UL certified here and approved by our fire department, like a larger scale battery that could replace like a generator, for instance, on a construction site, it's a little challenging. And so we just have this kind of different context in different places, maybe because of the density, like in that case I just mentioned, and safety considerations. And yet I find it super helpful to know that some of these things are viable globally and people, be able to point to, okay, it's possible, we see it, it's happening there. What are the steps that we need to take to get our same context and infrastructure ready for a similar improvement? Another, talking about supply chain, something that we are trying to do on as many construction sites as possible is recycle gypsum drywall trim scrap. So the new construction trim scrap from an installation. And you say, that seems like really specific. Why would you do that? Well, we know that resource can be very easily recycled back into new drywall. It's basically like it's rock. But the other major driver is that we know that when that gets landfilled, that material specifically gets landfilled, it causes hydrogen sulfide gas generation in a anaerobic humid environment, which is basically all of our landfills, at least especially in the eastern US, but even in California. And that that exacerbates asthma for people that live around landfills. So there's like so many reasons. And it's also really easy to do this on construction sites. And anybody that's in construction that's listening to this, I feel like I get so much pushback on this sometimes, but it's just smart logistics. And so sometimes I shame people into this by saying, oh yeah, it's smart. We can't do smart logistics. Not our people at Consigli have been very on board with this because they understand, we kind of get it in at the very beginning of a project. And so the goal is really including more and more recycled material in that gypsum drywall that's closed loop recycled. We're at a very low percentage here in the US. In Europe, they're at like 30% post-consumer recycled content in their drywall. They have a different landscape there. They're like the cities are much closer together. There's not a lot of landfill space. And so the cost to dump in a landfill is very expensive there. So there's that's what I mean about different context. But here, when drywall gets landfilled, the landfill usually needs to remediate the gases that come from that. And I'm like, is it really worth the upfront landfill tipping fee to then have to go back and remediate the gases that are coming from it? So I think it's just like seeing what's happening in these other places. And when somebody says, oh, we can only, if a manufacturer says we can only take back 5% recycled content. Well, why? What, this is what's happening in another place. Japan's recycling 100% back into their drywall. So I find though there's a distinct context and infrastructure, I think that these other places can inspire us and teach us how to keep improving. And I'm sure there's things that other places learn from us or have learned from us as well. I like working in New York City because it's a really hard place to make improvements because of how dense our urban context is. And we do have so many regulating agencies. However, we also have some of the smartest people in the world. And I think that that ingenuity and oriented problem solving is super key to solving through those issues. And then once we do make something happen here, we can usually replicate it almost anywhere else because it really is hard to do here. So,
Great. Well, that was a really comprehensive answer, and I appreciate that you feel there are some examples we can look to and that there are a lot of people here in the United States who are working on these issues, and we are making a lot of progress. So I don't want our listeners to feel like things are slowing down. There's still a lot of momentum in this area, and we should be excited about what's on the horizon. To that end, Amanda and Alexis, I'd love both of you to talk a little bit about what are you most excited about in this space right now. Alexis, do you want to go first? What's keeping you motivated or optimistic about where construction sustainability in general is headed?
It feels like there's a lot of momentum. It feels like there's people from all different kind of aspects of the professional landscape that touch on the built environment, that are thinking through how to put these pieces together. And it's, obviously it's not like everyone's kind of sitting around a whatever drum circle every day, just kind of brainstorming and meditating on all of it. But there's just good collaboration. People are excited to talk about it, and it feels like there's fresh ideas that are being driven by that excitement, but also by all different kinds of pressures and changing realities. So it feels like things are happening, and people from all different aspects of the sector are talking to each other, which feels encouraging.
yeah, I agree. And I agree that there is a momentum that is maybe can sometimes get a little distracted, but it's a forward momentum that isn't going to stop because it is making sense in on a lot of fronts from cost perspective and just really looking far into the future what we're going to be needing. And I think people that are smart about business just are going to stay the course about on a number of these fronts. And I do, for me, I really am focusing and doubling down on a lot of areas that I know we need for many different reasons that just drive good business decision making. And so that's where I'm focused. I think also things like passive house are making a lot of sense right now, where we're increasingly electrifying buildings for a number of different local law reasons here in New York, but also just across just for a lot of different drivers. Because I do think we need to be continuously focused on resilience, and certifications like Passive House and just the construction detailing that affords in the case of having a blackout, which is occasionally going to happen, and just being able to downsize systems a little bit. I think that's exciting and sensible. And I see affordable housing leading on that front because people are looking ahead to operational costs whenever they're making decisions about how to put these buildings together, and being able to downsize systems and also hold livable internal temperatures in case of a blackout, an electrical blackout, making a lot of sense to people.
Thank you both. This has really been such a fascinating conversation. I came into this with a decent understanding, but Amanda, Alexis, you are both so knowledgeable, and you really inspired me to continue to be motivated about what's on the horizon in this sustainability construction arena. So thank you both so much for joining me and sharing your insights. Any closing remarks, any final words, anything you want to make sure that our listeners know before we close out today's episode?
And I just appreciate the opportunity, and it's been a fun conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thank you again to both of our amazing guests. To our listeners, if you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe to Springboard wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, this has been Springboard. Thanks so much. The content of this podcast and its supplemental material is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers in their individual capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Side Paget and Rizal and or any of the clients they represent.